Klein Institute of the Unknown. I am writing to you about my late husband. His name was Richard Inman, and he died in May. He was affected by something that no one can explain. There are professional notes enclosed with this letter if you care to read them. I wasn't able to gain anything from them, but if I can't, maybe you can. I wouldn't normally taint Richard's legacy by bringing him up with a paranormal institute. It feels really wrong, but no one else has given me anything but lies, and when they've been honest, they've told me they didn't know. He and I lived in Bedford, Indiana. We had been married 14 years. We had kids. 3 boys, Lucas, Richie, and Artie. Richie's the oldest. When his father went missing, he was 16. His younger brother Artie was 12, and Lucas was 7. Even at the end of his life, Richie had a way with his father. Even if he had no idea which was up, literally, and thought I was a celestial attendant here to save him from his illness, he'd know Richie. Richie would say, "I know what's happening in there." And Richard would freeze wherever he was, ill as he became, and stare at him. He'd look at all of us, in turn. One time he told us, each of us, that he loved us. Then he told us that Borie was calling him, and he bawled his eyes out and begged for death. And then he laughed until he passed out. We never stayed while he laughed like that. It almost fooled us into thinking there was real glee in him, but the blood that poured from his eyes made it clear that that was impossible. But I'm ahead of myself. The day that he disappeared was a normal day. Richie and Artie used to play in the creek behind the house. They'd run up and down that moist old riverbed trying to catch each other for hours on end. It made them happier than any trip to town or carnival visit either Richard or I could concoct. But they were brothers, so every so often they'd end up with a disagreement. And one of them would come storming into the house demanding that his case be heard, and that's what happened the day Richard was taken from us. I was painting the fence in the yard, out in the open prairie. The wind wears the paint away, so 2 or 3 times a year I'll work my way around the house, throwing white paint on the fences. I remember that I had only just set my paint down and crouched to begin touching up the fence when I heard footsteps behind me. Richie and Artie stood panting about 2 steps from me. I was going to give them a sly look while they caught their breath, but they never stopped to do so. They were really spooked. They asked me about the well, the one by the creek, and I recall getting really angry, not at the kids, but at Richard, the previous owners, and most of all myself. There was no well on our ranch, at least not that I knew of. We surveyed the land carefully before digging our own well to supply the cattle with water, so it sort of ruffled my feathers to hear we built one for nothing. Wells don't just appear, especially not the type they saw. They described the type of well you'd see in an old English town, or a cartoon, the type that's just a pit, walled by stone or brick with a little stream of water at the bottom. A cylinder of stones, a little more than waist high, with an awning of oak over it and a bucket hanging on an old twine string. The boys later said the rope was old enough to be prickly. I called Richard, and he answered cheerfully, telling me that lunch was ready and that Lucas was missing his family, cooped up as he was. The poor toddler was sick and couldn't play with his brothers. The last time I saw Richard was when he kissed me before jogging out to see the well. He rounded the little bluff out there and was gone. I'll try to tell the story of Richard's disappearance as best I can. Somehow, someway, he fell inside of the well. Artie says that Dad leaned over the well to get a good look, when there was a sound like a man screaming, really abruptly, from deep inside the well. That startled my husband into falling inside. Richie says that his father reached into the well, as though he saw something made of gold that he craved, and then something slowly and without a pause grabbed his wrist and pulled him inside. The well itself was only about 3 feet wide, so both of the boys said he tumbled down with a shower of cracks and scrapes. The current at the bottom whisked him away. The manhunt lasted 2 weeks and was not fruitful. A diver explored the water beneath, and some device or other led them to where the water flowed. No living Richard, no dead Richard. I got a call from the sheriff a handful of months later. There was a man matching my husband's description pulled from inside a similar well, 3 miles south of Chairia, India, 8,000 miles from Indiana. He was found to be clutching the bucket, attempting to pull himself from the frigid water below him. It's a miracle that, in his madness, he was able to communicate who he was and where he came from. He had to be restrained. At one point, he even tried to re-enter the well, but local police were able to keep him by himself long enough for the ambassador's office to take notice and help get him home. He was treated in a nearby hospital for a broken wrist, water damage to most of his extremities, all manner of burns, frostbite, damage from hypoxia, dehydration, but not starvation. He survived miraculously, and then they sent him to the U.S. What they sent was not my husband. I believe that it's his body, but he no longer inhabits that mind. If he does, then his continued existence was a truly cruel act. An army of doctors, psychologists, and psychiatrists worked on him for 2 weeks. They asked him questions and performed a surgery or two to remove gunk that had accumulated from his time inside of filthy water. No one knows how he got to India. If anyone does, then they've kept it from me. The lead doctor, a man from Lordham called Victor Venable, was one of the nicest people we met throughout the process of treating Richard. He told me that everything Richard had become was unnaturally created. He treated us well, and even came to dinner once. The doctor's notes are his. He was kind enough to loan them to me, and I made a copy with his permission. He was the one who explained Richard's condition to me. It wasn't easy, I'm sure. I didn't react particularly well. He brought me a folder of diagnoses an inch and a half thick. Reading it was almost unbearable, but Venable, bless him, went through every page with me. Everything from acute schizophrenia to paranoia and depression, multiple personalities, it was all there. It was properly months before we were allowed visits. They were agonizing. I was told that he was volatile and even suicidal at any given moment. I don't think that he improved when we were allowed to finally see him. I think Dr. Venable took pity on us, and I think he knew Richard wouldn't last. He drew. A lot. Almost constantly, actually. If he was prevented from drawing, he'd become violently suicidal and refuse to eat. So they let him. After he passed, they let me decide the fate of his art. Almost 2 5-foot-tall cabinets full of incoherent art. I kept one drawing. It's representative enough. And I suppose it will have to do. I made them burn the rest. I've sent it to you. His death was something of a mystery. He was drawing peacefully one morning in the fall, just like they let him do every morning until they worked up the will and manpower to make him take his medicine. Then, when his supervising nurse turned his head, blinked, or left the room, depending on whose account you believe, he was dead. His forearms were torn to shreds, gutted 2 inches deep, but his wrists, elbows, shoulders, chest, thighs, ankles, and forehead remained strapped to his bed. It will come as no surprise to your institute that the weapon with which he killed himself, or any evidence of how he's died, has been lost. I don't generally speak with my children. I live on the farm in Bedford. Lucas and his brothers are with their godfather in Pittsburgh. My finances are settled for the rest of my days. Not that I want all too many more. This is what Dr. Venable said about my husband. It was his last office visit note before he died. Richard Inman was found just south of Churia, India, more than 8,000 miles from his home in Bedford, Indiana. Prior to his incident, Richard Inman was a rancher and a respected man whose family had no history of mental illness to speak of. He has 3 surviving children, each of who continue to resist showing symptoms. After his incident, Richard Inman is not the same. He has contracted a myriad of symptoms of various mental illnesses, as well as fragments of others, most of which, to the best of my ability, I have found to be chronic. No medication, treatment, and not even the healing effects of time have been able to improve his condition. Acute schizophrenia, acute paranoia, some very specific and rare phobias. He has become deeply bipolar, alternating not only between moods and mindsets, but between symptoms of mental illnesses. There are times when I have been unable to find symptoms of depression in him, only to find later that they have been hidden by his tendency to switch his personalities. He has been introducing new characters and delusions almost daily, and I have written down all of the people he tends to talk to and about. He frequently is unaware of my presence, although he occasionally regains enough sentience to explain highly complex subjects to me. One of these is the riddle of Richard Inman. I have written it on your paper. He told me clearly that if I can solve his riddle, then I will be able to understand his condition. I have tried. It is impossible. The capacity and complexity of Richard's mind may perhaps have been expanded by his time inside of the well, but if this is the case, then the subject matter and motives of his thought, and even the validity of his thinking, are all deeply in question. I've been unable to rule out any particular mental illness inside of Richard. It is deeply unsettling. To fathom that the only measure of a man's mental health is to attempt to rule out any particular condition is absurd. This man is deeply unstable. He has lost all grip on the corporeal aspects of our world. Only a handful of things were ever stable while caring for Richard. One day, he may be perfectly normal, save for some strange belief that all knowledge can be found inside a great lexicon at the end of time. And the next day, he may be smearing feces over the hidden observation windows in his room, and yet, the next day, he would be begging for the end of his life, searching for any utensil with which to bring about the end manually. But he was never ordinary. He never found days where he was actually himself, and he always claimed to know what happened to him. He would describe a man named Bagging Borie, a spindly man with arms, legs, and neck long as buildings that pulled the screaming Richard through that well and into his chamber. He described in intimate detail that, here I will omit, how Borie tortured him. He would tell me over and over that he heard Borie sing, and that it made him mad, and he told me that a celestial attendant helped him escape. If there had been anything to do for Richard, I would have found it. Never in my life have I found myself so engrossed by a patient. This man babbled about nothing prior to his death, something I firmly believe was a mercy. That being said, I wish Richard peace in what comes after. I hope that his mind is freed of whatever illness takes it now. What happened to Richard was a tragedy. Richard embodied madness as an absolute, and yet it was strange. The fear with which he would tell me these stable factors and the repetition and consistency with which he told me these things made me very close to believing him. But alas, he's gone now. There's little else to tell. I hope you can make some sense of everything that's here. The drawing, the poetry, everything is beyond me. This cannot be ordinary. Sincerely, Elizabeth Inman. P.S. The well, Borie's well. It used to sit just out of view of the house, around the bend of a little bluff. But this morning, as I was getting ready to place this letter in the mail, I noticed that it was in plain view from my kitchen's back window. What do you make of that?